Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I hope that you all enjoyed the very energetic music that, of course, carries a very good message about how we can build our resilience here in the Caribbean region. Um, today, we will be having the second day of session 2 of this workshop, this regional workshop on developing sound health vulnerability and adaptation assessments for transformational and paradigm shifting project proposals. I am Keisha Rodriguez. I'm a assistant consultant with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, working with the project development unit. And these sessions are being presented by the project development unit of the 5Cs. So today, I hope that you all enjoyed the presentations yesterday. You received you were able to receive the recordings and the presentations and perhaps went over them. As well, you worked on your baseline logical framework, developing further your situational analysis. So I hope you did your homework and we'll look at some more today with some of the project ideas that you have and you came up with. So as we get into today, I just want to remind you of the virtual protocols. Of course, the different controls for Zoom. If everybody is muted and there's no video when you enter the room, but if you need to make an intervention, you can unmute your mic, and if you want, if you still wish, you can show your video. Please raise your hand, and so the host and myself, we could see you, or one of the presenters can see you and call on you if you need to make an intervention or ask a question. Or make a comment. So I think we're all familiar with those virtual protocols. We had also asked for the purpose of to help us assist us with the breakout groups, that you put the name of your country or the abbreviation of your country beside your name. And this just helps us to see, try to group people in the same groups from the same country, and this assists in looking at the concept ideas when we're doing the breakout groups. In terms of today's agenda, of course, it has been revised a bit because we had to make a quick change yesterday. So the agenda today is, of course, we're doing the preliminaries and recap at present. And then that would be followed by the presentation by Dr. Danielle Kane, the GCF concept note development, logical framework, theory of change, and of course, question and answers if there is any. And then that would be followed by a practical session where you can go into your small groups and start to look at the Excel sheet and developing that logical framework. That will be followed by the second presentation, which will be the gender and environmental and social safeguards, presented by our environmental and social specialist, Mr. Ian Morrison. And then after that, we will again have some time for a practical session and as well sharing some of the project ideas and how we have further developed them. And the last part of the workshop will be Mr. Vincent Peter presenting the next steps toward developing a full funding proposal, and of course, answering any questions that you may have regarding the entire workshop, as well as the next steps in project development or furthering your project. So that is what we have scheduled for today, and we will try to keep on time. and ensure that you have a very useful, a very productive session, and you can get as much as you can from it. So in terms of the recap of day one, so yesterday we had two presentations. And the first presentation was from Mr. Ryan Zuniga, Project Development Specialist here at the center, and he introduced the climate rationale and the developing of the situational analysis. And of course, we are using the GCF concept note framework. Reason why, as Ryan had explained, because the GCF is seen as a very rigorous, robust process where you can gather all the information that you need to develop your project, or to develop the concept note for the project. And so using it as a template is very, very useful. So that is the process that we have been presenting. And Brian, of course, mentioned that the situational analysis is all about how you tell your story, how you tell how climate is going to impact your sector, in this particular sector being health, or how it is already impacting it. And then what are your needs to be able to build your resilience, and what are the barriers that prevent you from addressing those needs. And so the project sits at that space where you're addressing the barriers to fulfilling those needs. And then, of course, the second presentation, we had Mr. Vincent Peter speak about the investment, the GCF investment criteria, against which proposals are assessed. And of course, these being impact potential, that is the potential of the project to contribute to the achievement of the fund's objectives and result areas. The paradigm shift of the project, how you can catalyze long-term impact beyond a one-off investment, as well as sustainable development potential. What are the wider economic, environmental, social, gender, health co-benefits of the project? As well as country ownership, very, very important, which is the degree to which the project fits within your particular country's existing policies, your NDCs, your strategies, your climate strategies and institutions, as well as the efficiency and effectiveness of the project, the economic and the financial soundness, as well as the cost effectiveness and the ability to leverage co-financing. And lastly, the responsiveness to the needs of the recipients, the vulnerability and financing needs of beneficiary countries, and the extent to which the project addresses vulnerable groups. So that's just a quick recap of some of what was covered yesterday. And I know today's presentation on the logical framework will further develop how your project will, or your concept note. So I think we can now go into that first presentation. I believe Dr. Kane is here with us. Dr. Kane.
Hi, good morning, Keisha. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I think I can. Michelle, I think I kind of start sharing your screen. I guess now that Keisha is no longer sharing, I can share. All right, perfect. All right, could you just confirm that you're seeing the presentation mode, right?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. Good morning again, everybody. I must apologize for missing yesterday's session. In fact, for those who would have seen the agenda before, would have known that my presentation should have been yesterday, but because of a request that was made of me, I had to step away yesterday. And so I'm actually still not home, but decided that I needed to do this presentation on the go. Based on the recap though, and the little bit of time that I got to review some of what happened yesterday, I see that Ryan and Vincent would have set the stage for some of what I'm about to present today. I'll be taking more of a general approach, not necessarily for the GCF, because what we have here is very much applicable to many other bilateral and multilateral partners in terms of their results frame and what needs to be done. You'd have heard from Ryan yesterday talking about the climate rationale and the situation analysis. Today, I'm hoping to talk about the logical framework and the theory of change approach to building out your project, building on some of what you've done yesterday. As Keisha said at the top I'm Daniel Kane. I'm a project development specialist with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. All right, so without delaying any further, let's get right into it. So we'll start, by looking at what is the logical framework, what that approach is. It really is just a tool that helps us to develop, plan, and manage project activities, no matter what that kind of project is. It's just a framework that shows you how you relate activities to a particular objective or outcome, how it is that you account for risks and assumption, how it is that you set out criteria. In this case, you'll learn a little bit later about indicators. And indicators are critical when it comes to monitoring the progress of the project and the success of the project. And of course, these are the things that evaluators and donors review when they start to check the success of the project. So the logical framework sets out, as the name suggests, a logical flow of how activities are connected to outputs and outputs connect to outcomes, and outcomes are connected to high-level impacts and results that we are hoping to derive from the project. It considers the risks and assumptions that are associated with these actions, and how it is we monitor and evaluate the outcomes, outputs, outcomes, and results of the project. As I would have said earlier on the previous slide, we're going to be looking out for some key terms as we go through here. We'll be looking out for things like indicators. We'll be looking out for things like assumptions. We'll be talking about how it is our activities are connected to our objective, overall objective of the project. And we want to see that information presented in a logical framework. When we get to the theory of change section of this, the idea is that at a glance, on one page, on one diagram, we should be able to see what the project is about. We should be able to decipher the critical information about the project and identify what are the critical activities, what are the critical outputs, what are the critical outcomes of the project. So what are the steps that we need to consider when developing our logical framework? We need to identify the sector, the area, the situation that we intend to handle or deal with or build a project around. And in this case, we're talking to the persons who have some interest in climate change and health. Otherwise, you would not have been in this workshop. Many of you here might know more about the health sector than I do. I'm just an economist who is a project developer, who then is able to help other persons in other sectors to develop their projects. So we need to identify what the situation is. We then need to analyze the stakeholders. We need to identify who are the stakeholders. Who are the persons being impacted by this problem, the situation, and what can they do about it? What is their level of influence on the situation? Are they the ones holding the resource? Are they the ones being impacted? Are they the persons who will implement the action on the ground? So we need to really identify a set of stakeholders that could contribute to the project. We analyze the problem, and I think yesterday when you went through the issue of building that climate rational, that was what you were doing. You were analyzing the problem, and from that problem, what you're coming up with are identifying the barriers, which then define the objectives that you have, which is to really overcome those barriers that you'd have identified. Once you've identified what the barriers are, and you want to now break down those barriers, you have to define the activities, as it says here, defining the intervention to solve the problems that you're facing. And once you have defined those, we want to set out what are the key assumptions around these activities. What do we need to consider in order to implement this project? What are the key assumptions? And then we go through the rest of the logical frame, identifying the indicator. How do we know that the activity has been implemented? How do we know that the result or outcome that we intended to realize has been realized? And then we want to identify the source of verification. How do I verify that the outcome was achieved? What are the sources that we'll talk a little bit more about what those are as we go further. And so by the time you've done all of that, what you end up with is a logical framework or matrix, which gives you a holistic picture of what the project intends to achieve as it is implemented. I want to take a few steps, back, setting the stage, but also ensuring that we are taking on board some of what was presented yesterday. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but just taking a step back and looking at problem formulation here and talking a little bit about that. The very first thing is that we can't talk about identifying problems without those being nested in national priorities. It's important that whatever action is being proposed is nested within the national priority or the local priority if we're dealing with a locality, a community or something to that effect. But it's important to ensure that the ideas that we're putting forward are nested within the national priority. And if they're not nested in the national priority, then it's important that we start to mainstream that issue into a national document and that sort of thing. So I know, for example, that climate change and health is one of those areas that still needs a lot of work, especially as it relates to mainstreaming climate change into the strategies of the health sector and that sort of thing. So it's important to do that. Now, we have step 2 and 3 there, and I like to think of them as parallel, but we could go with step 2 and then step 3. What we're doing in step 2 is what Ryan would have presented yesterday, which is how it is you go about building that climate rational. And for the health sector, because health is cross-cutting. We're talking about health in terms of nutrition, which is linked to food security. Health is also linked to water and water security, water quality. Health is also linked to critical infrastructure, for saving lives and ensuring that the healthcare facility are resilient to climate change. And then you have, the direct impact of climate hazards on human health, like, heat stress and that sort of thing. So we also have the issues of vector-borne diseases and that sort of thing. Of course, more research is needed on that. But here is really trying to build that case around what are the climate change impacts we're observing on human health, whether those are direct or indirect. But there are also other anthropogenic issues, man-made issues that aren't necessarily climate change related, in that man-made issues also create a problem. And in some instances, you cannot address the issue without addressing the other non-climate factors. So it's important in formulating your problem that you're considering the entire picture. Of course, when it is a climate change project, you want to bring forth that strong climate change case, because if you're trying to get climate change financing from, say, an entity like the GCF that was dedicated mainly for climate change, you want to ensure that that case is well built, but you cannot ignore the human processes, the anthropogenic issues that exacerbate the climate change problem. Now, once you've combined what the climate change impact, both direct and indirect, as well as look at the processes that we as humans have and how those contribute to the issue of vulnerability and risk and exposure, how it is that we come up with the problem. And once we formulate our problem, then the key thing is to now see how we identify the barriers and then the action to break down those barriers so we could address the problem that we're facing. I just have this example here of what we call an impact chain analysis, and it's important to kind of look at this, this analysis so you could understand here. So we start here with the drivers of climate change: increased temperature, change in precipitation pattern, more extreme rainfall. Forgive me, this is more of a broad perspective on climate change, not necessarily specific to the health sector, right? And then, from the drivers of climate change, we have what we call the hazards: change in the season, longer summer, shorter winter, delay monsoon rainfall, unpredictable season, flooding, and we could go on hurricanes, we could go on and on. Those are the hazards that we face. And then we have what we call the pathway and the impact. So the pathway is that we have delay in flowering, which has implications for agriculture. Heat waves, decreased crop productivity, and these then have impact of issues related to health, loss of biodiversity, damage to crop, again, reducing productivity level, decline in income and protein, food security issues there, and nutrition issues there, damage to livestock, damage to infrastructure, of course, loss of income. It results, or the impact is a loss of income, increase in food insecurity, and impact on health. What this does is really just set out logically, how do we move from the climate drivers all the way through to impact? And it's important to be able to see this flow from what are the climate drivers straight through to what are the impact. And this is some of what I think Ryan would have covered yesterday, but I thought it important to just recap on that so that we're all on the same page going forward. All right. So when we're completing the situation analysis, these are the questions we're answering. I don't think I want to get into that again because I think Ryan would have covered it yesterday. But one of the key things there I just want to highlight is bullet point 4. What are the barriers to addressing these impacts? And these barriers could be along the line of social issues, gender, fiscal space, regulatory, technology, financial, ecological, or institution. What are institutional? What are the key barriers? So you've identified these impacts as we have here on the end here. These are the impacts. You know, what are the key barriers? What are the barriers that are stopping your organization, stopping you? What is stopping the population from addressing those barriers? All right. Well, let's get back to the logical flow. Once you can answer those questions of the barriers, it really sets out the kinds of actions, or help us to set out the actions that we need to overcome those barriers to be able to address the issue that we're faced with. This is just a simple diagram of the logical framework. And this diagram really is here to just talk about a few logics that we have to take into consideration when we start to develop our logical framework. The first one we have is a horizontal logic, right? And the horizontal logic is us going, as you could see that arrow going across, which says if I have my activity, or if I have my output, sorry, my output must have an indicator, there must be a baseline, there must be a target. I must be able to verify that. What does that mean? I just explain. I know I have some more information on this later on, but if my output is that 5 polyclinics, the output is that I'm retrofitting polyclinics, or polyclinics are retrofitted. What is the indicator? It's a number of polyclinics retrofitted. Do I have a baseline? Were there any polyclinics retrofitted before? Was there 1, was there 2, or was there 0? What is the target of the project? Are we aiming to retrofit 5, or is it 10, or is it 20 that we're aiming to retrofit? And then what is the source or the means of verification? How do we verify that the polyclinics were retrofitted? From project documents, from observation, and that sort of thing. So it's important to have that horizontal logic intact for your project. The next logic we have is a virtual logic. And the virtual logic is saying, if you have an activity, in this case, retrofitting a polyclinic, just to stick with the example I'm using, then that must lead to an output. And what is that output? An activity must lead to an output. An output must lead to an income, or a set of outputs lead to an outcome, right? And an outcome must lead to an impact. Note that the impact is the highest level. And we'll talk a little bit more about this particular logic because it is one of the most critical part of your logical framework. Your activities lead to your outputs lead to your outcomes lead to your impact, and that is important. That's a vertical logic. And then we have what we call the zigzag logic. And the zigzag logic says, okay, that column off to the right that has the assumptions. If I retrofit the activities to retrofit a polyclinic, what is the assumption that I'm making that this is going to happen? One could be that the technology and material required to retrofit the polyclinic is available. The output then is that the polyclinic is retrofitted. So what I'm saying here is to move from your activity to your outcome, the assumption must hold. There is an assumption, there are assumptions that we're making all the time. We're probably saying also no natural disaster will impact or will occur during the project period. If that assumption holds, then the output will be realized. If the output is realized and the assumption that is off in this column here holds, then the outcome will be realized. And if the outcome is realized and the assumption that we make holds, then the impact would be realized. So we have different levels of assumptions that are made about a project. And for us to move from one activity to an outcome, we have to, some assumptions have to be made. I will revisit this a little bit later, but again, you have your horizontal logic, you have your vertical logic, and then you have what we call the zigzag logic. And you want to test each one of these logic in your log, and once you've developed it, or while you're developing it, make sure you're trying to, as much as possible, keep that in mind. But once you're also done, you need to test your logical framework to ensure that all these logics are satisfied. All right, just switching quickly to the theory of change. The theory of change diagram is, I like to think of it as a simplified version of your theory of your logical framework. And this diagram really just gives a snapshot what the project is about. They are, of course, much more complicated theory of change diagram than the one here. And I actually have on the next slide the one that is preferred by the GCF, or what is put forward by the GCF here. But as you could see, again, there is that logic. And here I think I'm showcasing the vertical logic in a horizontal schematic diagram, right? Where we're moving from the climate change impacts and risks to the actions, the main barriers, what are the inputs we need, and as such activities lead to the outputs, and the outputs to the outcomes, and the outcomes to the impact. But this is just, giving somebody at a glance what the project is about, moving from what the climate change impact and risk is all the way up to the output. This diagram is a GCF example of a theory of change, which is slightly different from what I presented on the previous slide. And here you could see, again, there's 2 slides over where I had barriers and risks, mainly the assumptions as well. There's that zigzag logic. Here, you could see the assumptions are just placed at the bottom there. I will showcase one that I've done for myself that takes this approach is slightly different. But this is what they've presented as one that they prefer. Just a few things to highlight, though. The barriers and risks are kind of in one row. And then, as I said, once you've identified your barriers, usually your barriers tell you, and risks tell you what are the activities to implement it. But once you've identified the activities then result in outputs, and then the outputs result in outcomes. Note that the GCF have here co-benefits, and it's the first logical framework that I've seen that really brings that in. But remember, the outcome areas of the GCF are mainly geared towards climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, reduce number of beneficiaries, number of persons made more resilient, number of persons trained as it relates to climate change. But in some instances, there are other benefits, co-benefits, whether they're social, environmental, or economic, such as if it is that you have an increased number of persons employed. That's not something that probably would show up in the GCF outcome areas, but it's a co-benefit of the project. And I think GCF is trying to capture those co-benefits, but also ensuring that those co-benefits are linked to the sustainable development goals. So if it is that the project, while its intention is to tackle climate change and health, but it results in reduction in poverty, they want to see that co-benefit captured here so that they could also report to their board and other stakeholders about the co-benefits of the projects that they're implementing to address climate change impact, but are also contributing to the sustainable development goals outside of goal 13, which is climate action. And then, of course, our outputs and all our co-benefits contribute to a goal statement. And here we have a goal statement which uses the if, then, because approach. If the country does X, then this will happen because of this, XYZ, right? If, then, because. It's showing that if you take a certain action, then it results in some change because of the action that was implemented, or the action empowering or changing behavior, something to that effect. So here what we're looking for is what we call the paradigm shift. How are we doing things differently? How is the project going to result in things being done differently? All right. Now let's take a little bit of time. I talked about activities, outputs, outcomes, impacts. And I'm going to apologize from now if I get this word wrong, because it always is a tongue twister. I did have coffee, so maybe it might flow smoothly. Now, there are these three, sphere that we need to consider when we're developing our project. And the first one, the yellow sphere, there is a project sphere of control. Now, the persons who are developing the project with the executing entity in mind. So if the executing entity, I'm just going to use examples because it tends to be easier that way. You say the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Health, the question is, what is in the sphere of control of the Ministry of Health? And we could go a little bit further if it is, just a local health center that is trying to implement a project. What is in the sphere of control of that local health center? What can they control? What do they have control of? Now, that is key. Why? Because never place activities in a project that you don't have any control over. What do I mean? And then you'll see many projects have it. Oh, we're gonna pass legislation. No, that is not within your sphere of control. That is at the level of government. So there's no way you could pass legislation because that is the government's business. You influence, which is where that takes us to the sphere of influence, where our outcomes are. So our intention, if it is our intention, is to see amendments to legislation. What is in our sphere of control is probably we could host workshops to sensitize policymakers. Probably we could draft recommendations, but that's as far as your sphere of control goes. The sphere of influence is where you come in. You're hoping that through those sensitization workshops that you would have hosted and had control over, as well as those recommendations that you could have drafted, are then taken on board by the politician to pass legislation. Here, what I'm saying, the project only has a sphere of influence at the outcome level. We tend to not have full control over all the outcomes of the project. And I remember I mentioned assumptions, and this is where assumptions are important. If those assumptions hold, then the outcome will occur. And then that green box there talks about the sphere of the beneficiaries. And this is even much higher. What is in the direct control of the beneficiaries? So if it is, just continuing with the example I have, if it is the idea is to enact legislation, those legislation are not for the politicians, they're for the persons who it impacts. That is where the sphere of stress of the beneficiaries come in. Of course, the beneficiaries should be a part of the entire cycle, from activities straight through to outcomes and be consulted. But the key here is that at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to implement actions, which then leads to the beneficiaries having, engaged and benefit in a tangible way from the outputs and the outcomes and the impact of the project. So the key thing I want you to take away from here, and as a project developer, what this diagram means to me is that yellow box is very critical. While I am trying to ensure that the project benefits and derive the maximum benefit to the beneficiaries and the stakeholders, I must consider what is in my control, what I can control. So I will not talk about putting a satellite into space because that is outside of my control. But I could talk about how it is I could influence those persons who have the ability to do that, or how I could provide some interest there. And of course, at the end of the day, we're doing all of this for the beneficiaries. So again, take away from this, activities. Never have activities that are outside the sphere of control of the entities that are going to execute the project. All right. Your activities, as you could see on here, they're all action words: retrofit your healthcare facility, develop, implement, expand surge capacity, integrate climate-related risk into healthcare strategy, establish a network of climate change experts, train healthcare professionals on climate change and help install new instruments, equipment for monitoring of public health and early warning. You note all of those starting words or action words. So you describe activities as actions, all right? Indicators, what are indicators? Basically, our indicators tell us how we intend to measure the results of the project. And there are some key things that we need to ensure that our indicator have. And these are listed on the right side of this slide. We should be able to measure using the indicator. In some instances, we could use qualitative indicators. So the idea is to amend a policy, then it's just a policy that we're amending. We could, of course, count it. The policy amended or yes, no. That is also an indicator. But in other instances, quantitative indicators are also useful. Your indicator shouldn't take a direction. Note your indicator and your targets are two different things. So your indicator shouldn't take a direction. It should be neutral. So if it is polyclinics, it's number of polyclinics. That's your indicator. Retrofitting polyclinics. The indicator is number of polyclinics. Notice I didn't say greater than 10 polyclinics retrofitted. The indicator is just number of polyclinics. My target may be 10 or greater, but my indicator that I'm using is number. It has a consistent baseline. That is, our baseline is moving. So we're able to state what the baseline is at the moment. And if the baseline is this, where am I trying to get to? So I cannot say the baseline is X, but when I set my target, let me make that a little bit clearer. I cannot say the baseline is 2 orange, but my target is 3 apples. The two are totally different. So my baseline unit of measurement must be consistent with my target unit of measurement. All right, it lends itself to aggregation. We want to also consider issues related to being able to disaggregate the indicator by, sex, ethnicity, and other social consideration. That is important, especially when we're trying to mainstream gender consideration into our project. And later on, Ian will talk a little bit more about the environmental and social aspects that need to be considered when we're doing those projects. But if your indicator could mainstream gender and social consideration, it's important. I won't spend much time here, but these are just some examples of bad and good indicator. I'll just take one and then just read it. The court system providing effective access to the citizen. That really is a bad indicator. Effective access to the citizens. What does that mean? How do we measure that? Right. But here we have percentage of citizens who say that they have access to the court system to resolve dispute. We could measure that. We can measure the difficulty with the one I read before is what is effective? How do we define effectiveness? Whereas here, I think effectiveness is being defined as a percentage of citizens who say they have access to the system. We're looking at those who feel that they could access the services of the court. And so here, that is a better indicator. I spoke briefly about targets. I think this one is we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. My baseline is that we have one polyclinic retrofitted, and the project intends to do 10 polyclinics. But sometimes we need what we call a midterm target. So we might say, okay, by year 2 or halfway the project year, if the project is a 4-year project, by year 2, the intention is to have X amount of the target done. But you note that you have a baseline, what is the current situation, where I'm trying to get to by the midterm, and what is the end goal of the project, right? I'm gonna spend a little time on indicators. I noticed that we're running out of time, so I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on assumptions. And assumptions are very critical because they describe the situation and conditions which are necessary for the project success. I'm going to probably just use an example here to better demonstrate an assumption. We tend to set up project activities around training, and the activity here is to train healthcare professionals on climate change and health. The assumption would be, the output, of course, for that is the training. We're gonna host a training and a training workshop report. We're gonna train 40 persons in this, and the project can deliver that, and we have control over that. Now, to realize the outcome, which is probably healthcare professionals utilizing the knowledge that they've gained from the training, we must make an assumption around the healthcare professionals, getting trained, not even getting trained, but retaining the knowledge that they had gotten from the training, or they do remain within the healthcare sector. That's also one assumption we could make. But for us to observe the healthcare professional utilizing that knowledge within the healthcare sector, those assumptions that I just made had to hold. It's important for us to, put together assumptions that are realistic and make sense. And note that assumptions are things that are outside of your control. It's not something, so you can't say, I'm gonna assume that the training is held. That's not an assumption. If you have it on as an activity that you're gonna train these persons, it can't be that you're gonna assume that the training is held. No, you have written this activity, which is inside, or in that case, you're saying that activities in your control, it cannot then be an assumption. The assumption has to be some exogenous factor, some factor outside of your control that has the potential to derail the achievement of the output or the outcome. It's also important to distinguish between assumptions and risks. Assumptions are things that, as you said, they're outside of your control, but risks are things that they're also outside of your control, but have the potential to directly impact an activity, so such as a natural disaster occurring, whilst you have the training going or have training plan. That is a risk to the project. And Ian, I think will speak a little bit more about risks to projects later in his presentation, and he looks at the environmental and social aspects. The last thing I'm going to say on the assumption is killer assumptions. We have to be aware of killer assumptions. And what is a killer assumption? A killer assumption is one that has the probability of occurring with a probability of 1. It's going to happen, then it really is not an assumption. It's always difficult for me to come up with an example of so don't put an activity knowing that the likelihood of getting that outcome is basically, is basically 0. If you find any assumption of that nature where you cannot move from your output to your, from your activity to your output, or from your output to your outcome, because this assumption is not going to hold, then that is an activity that should not be in the project, or an output that should not be in the project, because that assumption, as you have it, has a probability of 1, meaning it's going to occur anyway. Just as an example, here, from the mitigation side, we have outputs, whatever the output is, but the outcome here, I'm just going to choose one from here: strengthen institutional and regulatory system for low emission planning and development. And the impact associated with that would be reduce emissions through increased low emission access and power generation. So you have your outcomes being linked to your impact. Whatever the outputs are, we need to determine those outputs that feed into our outcomes, which feed into the impact. On the adaptation side as well, I'm just going to jump to that. We have, let's take one, for example, strengthening awareness of climate-related risks and climate threats and risk reduction processes. And that feeds into an impact of improved resilience of ecosystem service, or it could be increased resilience of infrastructure and built environment to climate change threats. So what are the outcomes and how are they linked to the impact, or what impact are they linked to? And of course, we need to determine what the outputs are. But there are certain impacts, and the impacts have indicators. Here I'm showcasing some impacts and then what some indicators are. Increased resilience of health and well-being and food and water security. The indicator I'm using here is a number of males and female year-round access to reliable, safe and safe water despite climate shocks and stress. This here is an indicator. Note it doesn't take a direction. It's neutral. It just says number of males and female. It also mainstream that gender consideration. We're able to disaggregate males and females. So total number of beneficiaries disaggregated by male and female. So this is an indicator of this impact here. We could do the same thing at the outcome level. Let's take another 5.1. Strengthened institutional and regulatory system for climate responsive planning and development. And the indicator here is institutional and regulatory systems that improve incentive for climate resilience and their effective implementation. This is also very good indicator here, because as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the indicators could be quantitative or qualitative. In this case, this is a qualitative indicator. So when it comes to the identifying the baseline, what we're looking at are the institutional and regulatory systems that exist. And when we are setting our target, what we're looking at are, we're probably going to list those systems that we're going to be building as part of the project on top of what exists at the baseline level. So here, this indicator is one that is qualitative rather than quantitative. All right. And then I just want to, I'm going to make this be my last slide before I show one theory of change diagram. I'm just going to ask persons to just quickly, and maybe we could do this in the breakout group. I think let's hold this until we have the breakout group, and I'll just stop here so we could just move straight into the breakout group. Thank you. Keisha, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. Do we have any questions, comments for about the presentation? About is there anything that you would like to review, or anything that you any concerns? I saw there were some comments in the chat.
Excuse me, my name is Ampersand Simonat. I am a breastfeeding advocate. And over the years, for the last 3 decades, we have been fighting to promote this in the Bahamas. And part of my angle is, along with the additional benefits for our babies and for our families, living in a crisis situation, especially with hurricanes and all of those climate change things. I've had to fight to talk about deforestation, ozone layer destruction, and pollution of the waters, pollution of the landfills. So it has come in, so I'm so excited about it because I've married both those things together in my campaign. And Dr. Donnell Kane, please share your what do you call it, presentation, so I could talk to my friends on the team, because it makes sense what you're saying, because we were able to change a policy in OBGYN. We were sending midwives on ambulance calls, and that was a touchy thing. But we changed the policy because we found out through our investigation that we could change it. So I don't think we should wait for legislation. I know we have to have the help of the politicians, but we have to prove to them that we can, because we were efficiently using our limited resources, our ambulances, our midwives being taken out of our labor ward to go on the ambulance calls, which didn't make sense. We needed to educate our people, and we did that because finally, after our fight, they were able to put a good ambulance system in place, and paramedics were trained. And now midwives can stay where they're supposed to give care to the accountable patients. Am I making sense? Hello?
Yes, thank you very much for that. And that's a very important point. I was just going through the messages in the chat, and you're right. After investigating, you recognize that you actually had control over the policy.
So please, if you can send me a copy so I can share it with our friends who are not here, so we can marry those two things, because climate change was one of my assignments when I did my bachelor's in management. I still remember the professor talking about climate change, and since then, it has been very important for me. I've been trying to do compost, trying to, be a part of not being a, what do you call it? Enemy to climate change, but a friend.
Yes.
I thank you. This has been very exciting for me, listening to your topic, because it just wakes up all of your dead cells to start thinking objectively again,
Yes.
as an agile learner. Thank you.
All right, perfect.
Thank you. I see 2 hands up. We have Chris, would you like to go ahead? And then followed by Jacinta.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Donald, for your very interesting presentation. I just was wanting to ask you a little bit about the three different logical frameworks, the horizontal, the vertical, and the zigzag. So there's a lot of terminology here, and some of the phrases, as far as I can see, have sort of similar meanings in some ways, like indicators and outputs. And you mentioned the fact that we should be testing our projects out using all three log frames. So could you just comment a little bit on whether these are sort of mutually exclusive or complementary? And because in my experience, we've sort of, in projects, we've used one of them, like I've used the vertical log frame in the past. So how do we sort of, how do you recommend us to use these three different types of log frames when we're developing these kind of projects? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you know, persons prefer a different approach, meaning all three logics that I presented are important. They should be a part of your log frame. From my own experience, depending on the donor you're working with, you know, the rigor that needs to go into the results framework or the log frame that you put forward varies. Now, the key here is to, let me just say where I like to start. I like to start, what are my barriers? And then from my barriers to my activities to my outputs, outcomes, to my impact, because that really is the crux of the matter. But then once you start, once you get those aspects done, you then need to start to think about the monitoring and evaluation aspect of the project. And once you start to think about the monitoring and evaluation aspect of the project, then the other logics become very much relevant. So you're gonna train 40 persons. You know, your indicator becomes very important. So the horizontal logic is now needed. So you have to now go through and you have to do the horizontal logic, because those indicators and your targets and your baseline are important for monitoring evaluation of the project outcome. You know, some don't, I've seen where the risks and assumptions, you know, persons don't kill you so much for them, but they are also important. And why? Again, because of the importance placed on monitoring and evaluation of the project outputs and outcomes. Because if you did not identify the assumptions and the risks from the start, when the project is done or is going, you will come up against certain things which, if you had identified them from the onset, you would have been able to manage them. For example, we know we live in the Caribbean, and the hurricane season is June to November. Then we should know that certain activities we might want to reconsider hosting those or executing those during that period. So if you don't identify those risks, it's important. The question is, where is your starting point? And as I said, my starting point is usually what I presented as a vertical logic. But at the end of the day, in completing the results framework or the log frame, I have to consider all the other logics. Right? I hope that answered it.
Thank you. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Jacinta, you can go ahead.
Thank you so very much. I want to say, Dr. Kane, that as an educator, I sat, listened, absorbed. I was able to internalize so much of what you said because of the manner of presentation, in terms of the graphics, in terms of the visual aids, simple arrows moving from one step to the next. And I'm telling you, sir, this has been most instructive, most informational for us with regards to how can we now proceed to kernelize, as it is, to create a proposal that should be worthy of success and approval. One area that I am struggling with is the assumptions and the risks, and then the killer risk. And so please share with me again, one, just very briefly, a distinguishing example of the two, and then the three. That's number one. Number two, who, sir, in this organization may serve as a technical support for us that we can email and ask them to review our proposal before we submit it for approval. And then finally, sir, I'm a veteran educator, and I remember doing teaching practice, and there was so much that they wanted from us at that time. But we just simply asked, can we get a template of what it is you're asking for? And they gave us the A. They gave us about 3 or 4 A projects from different countries. And so it was almost like a breeze going forward. Is there a template that we can get of winning approved proposals that can assist us? Thank you so very much again for this opportunity to learn.
Thank you very much for that. That was really good to hear. So let me take the last one first, and then work my way, the last two first, and then work my way up. So I'm part of a team within the 5 Cs that we do project development, and in particular, we've been focusing a lot on projects that are going to the GCF. So we do support member states and agencies and organizations within member states to advance projects for submission to the donor. So definitely the team, some of whom are on this call, Ryan, Vincent, Keisha, we do, Ian, we support in reviewing those proposals before they're submitted to the different agencies. The key, though, is to ensure that that it is aligned with national priorities. We don't want to be spending time on projects that aren't the priority of the government, because at the end of the day, what we require is that the government provide what we call a no objection letter to the GCF, to us, to say this is something that they want to move forward with. And you could get our contact information from whether it's Baho or even Vincent, who is the lead on this project, to just reach out to us with project ideas that you may have. The GCF does have a template for its logical framework. I think we would have shared an Excel document, because although the GCF has its own template, I find that it might not be the best starting point for somebody who's doing this for the first time. And so we had created this Excel template. I don't know if maybe you're not, you did not receive that, but that is a template. And I think the intention after my presentation was to kind of move into groups where we could work in that template to see if we could come up with at least the vertical logic, which is your barriers, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And that would be a good starting point, because subsequent to that, we could then move into the other logics. Just to the assumptions and risks. Assumptions are things that need to hold for you to realize a particular output or outcome. So for example, we could have a risk and an assumption that kind of is centered around the one variable, but it's not the same thing. I'm gonna give you an example. A risk to the implementation of a let's say we're going to build a hospital. A risk that one has to consider in relation to that, the building of that hospital, is whether we have to, whether it can be impacted by, let's say, storm surge. Where are we placing it? What are the environmental and social factors that could impact that hospital? What are the risks to building that hospital? Is it vulnerable to climate change, like let's say storm surge? Where are we placing it? That is a risk to it. An assumption is that the hospital would be built. No, that's an output. Yeah. The assumption could be around the material needed to build this hospital is available locally. You don't have control over where these materials are. Of course, it'll be useful that you know where these are. But in any instance, you're developing in this project, I don't think you're going out looking to find out if there are nut bolts and screws on island for this facility. So the assumption is that you have a contractor and the material available to execute building this. Those are assumptions. The risks are something else. I kind of tried to. I hope this made it a little bit clear in terms of what are risks versus assumption. And maybe when Ian, I don't know, Ian, on the risk side, any particular risk you could identify for us at this point?
That was very helpful, Dr. King. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
There's a question from Ms. Allison. Do you have?
Thank you very much, Kisha. Thank you, Dr. Kane, for such a wonderful presentation. I was wondering whether or not you could expand a little bit on the outcomes and the impact, the differentiation. Years ago, when we would do in project management, you would consider in speaking to outcomes, you would incorporate the impact and output as a direct output from the process, outcome, impact. Now I'm realizing there's specific attention to emphasize or decouple impact with outcome. But I would, so I'd like your guidance on that. I mean, being involved in this and with your experience, to get a clearer differentiation between impact and outcome at this point.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, and part of why you're seeing that coming through here, as I said, different donors have different areas. And in some instance, you'll see impact or you'll see results, which is at the highest level. What's happening here is the identification that all these projects are nested within larger frameworks of countries. So whilst we are developing these projects that, for example, have outcomes that are specifically related to climate change, they have more far-reaching impact. And let me try to see if I. At the impact level is very high level. So if one takes, for example, a country's objective of eliminating poverty, that is at the highest level. the intention is to eliminate poverty. But once you've done your analysis, you're going to have outcomes in a project that contribute to the reduction of poverty, but not eliminate poverty. So the high level objective or impact here is that you are contributing to the reduction of poverty, which is the country's part of the country's objective of eliminating poverty. But below that, you have what we call the outputs, and the outputs are connected to different outcomes. And it is a combination of these outcomes that then contribute to that high level impact. So use the example again of reducing poverty. So the impact is reducing poverty here, but what does it take to reduce poverty? It is going to take education, which is another one outcome area. It is going to probably take technology, which is another outcome area. It is going to take, infrastructure, resilience building in another area. So depending on the donor you're working with, like here in the case of the GCF, where there is a clear distinction between, and I'm gonna just go back to these slides because maybe that might help as well. You see the outcomes and the impacts. One is higher than the other. The GCF separates mitigation from adaptation, and under mitigation, they have 4 impact areas. Under adaptation, they have 4 impact areas as well. But to get to those impacts, you could take several different paths. So several of these outcomes could be applicable to one impact area. I hope you understand.
Yes,
Let's
I really, thanks. That really clarified it for me. And especially your poverty example, but I don't mean to cut you short because the more examples you give, the better. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kane. Thank you everyone for your questions and comments. We will have a little change to the to the agenda. We will go to the next presentation and then we'll have the breakout after. So Ian, are you ready with your presentation?
Hi, good morning, Keisha.
Hi, good morning, Ian.
Okay, give me a second. Okay, good morning, Keisha. How are we looking?
It's fine, and you're seeing your presentation.
Okay. Hey, good morning, colleagues. So, as Keisha said, you will know my name, and I will be talking about the environmental and social and gender considerations in the projects for the Center for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, and also for the funders. Generally, these things overlap, and as my colleagues before me said, had indicated that We take the GCF approach because this is the most stringent. So I am following with my colleagues. Okay, today I will discuss with you what are the 5 C's, environmental and social safeguards that include gender. And again, I think one said these things are not mutually exclusive, but for the purpose of the presentation, you may find that I am separating some of the issues just for discussion. So I'll talk about the gender mainstreaming, the importance in gender mainstreaming, and in the context of climate change, the project cycle and the screening, the process that you will need to go through. And I think while I would like, you should be paying attention here. There are other opportunities and we're available to assist you when you're developing your project proposal or your concept note or your idea at whatever level. And then the expectations at the end. So I would just like to set the context here. As you know, this is from the World Health Organization. We know that climate change is the biggest threat to humanity. That is no illusion. We know that, and the impacts through it will be air pollution, disease, water contamination. This will force the displacement. It will sever some of the food security if we're not careful, and it will definitely put pressure on mental health in general. And this is an alarming factor. And if we don't pay attention to this, it could definitely increase. And we're trying to avoid that. That it takes these environmental factors, takes about 13 million people, take the lives of about 13 million persons per year. And furthermore, the World Health Organization went on to say that the social and environmental determinants, so the factors of health, clean air, safe drinking water, food security, and food security. Give me 1 second. Yes, and shelter. Climate change will affect these issues. And what we know, the poorest of the poor, or the poorest, not necessarily the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, that least have the ability to protect themselves will be most effective. The other issue is normally circulated around the discrimination and gender norms. What does it mean? So men, women, boys and girls, and we will be impacted differently in this regard by climate change. So to set the stage, what we normally speak about, the 5 C's has the overarching framework that guides our process, our considerations for the environmental, social safeguards, and these include gender. And I'm saying, when I'm speaking again, these things are not mutually exclusive. They're all intertwined, from the environment that affects the social, and inevitably it affects gender. So, but it is important for us to consider the principles that guides the safeguards. And we have about 6 principles, and I'll go through these quickly because of the interest of time. The accountability, empowerment, equity, preservation, prevention, and protection. I want you to keep these things in the forefront of your mind. So overall, the environmental and social management system that the 5 C's has in place is to generally to promote a paradigm shift. You've heard my colleagues speak about this before, a paradigm shift towards a low emission and climate resilient development pathway in the context of to ensure that we do not exploit or overuse the resources that we have now, and to allow the future generation, future peoples to have that benefit, or have that resource for their livelihoods into perpetuity, and to effectively and equitably manage environmental and social risk. You heard Daniel and my colleagues before me speak about this risk, and environmental and social benefits to improve environmental and social performance in its activities. And this, we want it to be consistent over time. So just a quick rundown. This accountability, we want to make sure that we have the support system that people can depend on for their, and are responsible for their actions. And I guess a genuine, in a way, a genuine intention to do good. We want to empower people to become self-reliant. We don't want it to be a system where people become too dependable, but also to build capacity for self-reliance and determination. And we want to make sure people are happy and they can uplift themselves, help themselves, and by doing so, help the community. The equity, we want to ensure that there is the equitable distribution of benefits. We don't want the cost of the whole issue of climate change to fall disproportionately on the vulnerable. So we want to make sure that there's equity, and you will see this normally in most sustainable development goals. The issue of preservation will preserve culture and history, culture and ethnicity, diversity, and to make sure that these things are not lost in the whole movement, or the whole reasons why are we trying to protect. And the prevention, we want to make sure that there is a system that we can rely on for sustainable of the community, and the protection for people, health, security, and ecosystems. You can stop me at any time if you choose. And Keisha, can you please give me a 3-minute warning?
Okay, sure, Ian, we will.
Thanks, Keisha. So what are these safeguards and why are they important? So the center screens your project, and these are all the considerations that the center will take. Well, these are the guidelines that the center will use to consider your project. These are absolutely important. After you develop all your project development, your ideas, and all that Daniel explained just before, once you have a project development consistent with that project and the activities, it is a wise, I would say, a wise advice for you to look at these performance standards and to understand them at the onset, because you don't want to have to be revising, or your project is rejected for some reason or the other. As we know it, these safeguards are absolutely important. I can't say that enough. And they can derail your project if you don't accurately address the issues that are outlined in the safeguard. So there are 9 safeguards, and these safeguards these 9 performance standards, and the performance standards are generally very user-friendly and understanding. They're self-explanatory, but I'll just go through them quickly. For the first performance standards, again, I want to make sure that you're thinking about these in the context of your development initiative. This is from the point that you have maybe the idea of a project, not necessarily broke the activities and the outcomes, but generally once you speak of a project, you would have some ideas as to what the activities will be, what the outputs will be, what the outcomes will be. Inherently, I think we do that as we develop projects. But along with that, while you're going along, you should also be scanning these safeguards, these performance standards, to make sure that when you get to the end, your project or your program has the best chance of being approved so you can implement. That is the most important thing. So for safeguard number 1, if you're seeing, it is one of the most important safeguards, because this is the safeguard that encapsulates all that we need to talk about. While we do kind of identify them in separate performance standards, the most important safeguard is the safeguard number 1, and it's the assessment and management of the environmental and social risk and impacts. Now, I think my colleague went through the idea of what is a risk and what is a hazard and what is vulnerability and what is exposure. But just generally speaking, we want to keep in mind that the hazard is the action that would cause either an adverse environmental condition or could harm someone in one way or the other. And this is also extended not only to people or persons, but is also extended to property. The risk is actually the probability of that person be harmed or exposed to adverse health effects, or maybe property be damaged if it comes in contact, or if it should be exposed to a hazard. So this is an absolutely important performance standards within the safeguard. Now, it also involves to identify and evaluate specifically the social and environmental risk, and to protect the human health and ecosystems function. A number of the issues will involve human health, especially because of the nature of this particular workshop and the issue of climate change in relation to health. And it should avoid, and these are the things that you should pay keen attention to. It should avoid, prevent, eliminate, or minimize air, land, and sea or water pollution. And these are the things that I explained at the beginning in terms of the World Health Organization information in relation to how polluted air, polluted water, polluted land will affect people and property. What's most important, this will affect the livelihoods of people and the livelihoods normally of the most vulnerable people. The issue of people with means, it may have that they have the capacity to respond to some of these issues. So this is absolutely important in the interest or in the issue of climate change in relation to health. I'll move on to performance standard number 2, the labor and working conditions. So we're not only exclusively looking at the environmental, social, and gender issues, but in concert, we're also looking at things that will affect and also, I think, have an impact on, that will have an impact on people, on communities. So we want to make sure that whatever you do, that that fundamental rights and privilege will be afforded to all workers. Absolutely important. We cannot separate these issues. So by doing that, we're ensuring that no one's rights will be exposed, eroded in any kind of way. And in doing so, we want to make sure that workers are fairly treated and they are provided with a safe and healthy working environment or conditions that they should work. And the benefits that they should have are also transferred to them in any way, and they're not further marginalized by trying to reduce the impacts of climate change. Performance standard number 3 will guide you through the resource efficiency. And this is to make sure that if it's not properly conceived and managed, that it will normally increase the level of pollution and consumption. And as we know, this is a finite resource, and we normally look at the safeguards are also safeguarding the future of our generation, or the present generation and the generation to come. So these activities, we want to make sure adapt to the measures that would lead to reducing greenhouse gas, and to make sure that we reduce the use by making sure we reduce the use of fossil fuels and increase the use of renewable energy such as wind, sun, hydro. Performance standard number 4 talks about community health and safety, and this is directly related to what you're doing. And this we want to ensure that the risk and impacts are avoided or minimized at all costs. This is absolutely important in ensuring or seeking to avoid or manage these exposures. They must guarantee, we must guarantee working in close collaboration with the public authorities and within the national and regional jurisdiction. So we're not in isolation, sorry. I'm sorry, I'll go back there. And we want to ensure that in all that you do, and in this case, it's particularly specific to you, that it will promote the health, safety, and security, which is why we're here. Performance standard number 5 deals with land acquisition and involuntary settlement. And as we know, sometimes there are different versions of this, that we want to make sure that people are not adversely affected that by, if you're doing a project and in this way, even though it might be a health or a major health project, people are further marginalized because maybe the land is acquired, it's not properly acquired, or maybe there is some involuntary resettlement. So this is a consideration that you must pay special attention to. The performance standard number 6 deals with the biodiversity conservation, and in doing so, again, we are ensuring that there's sustainable management of natural resources, and we're making use of opportunities to conserve. If there's a project and there are issues in relation to critical habitats being destroyed, or you have forest degradation, then in consequence, there will be an issue for this very same people that you're trying to protect. And in that, these are normally the most marginalized people, as you know. So under the protection, you have to pay special attention to the local and regional and international legislations or treaties or conventions that you have signed on to. Performance standard number 7, as you know, in some instances, some of these communities in Vincent, St. Vincent and Belize, we have a large population of indigenous people and maybe some of the other Caribbean islands. And we have to recognize that this is a special group. We're pointing it out because it's a special group. These are people that depend on the forest and forest products for their livelihoods. And this is particularly important to mainstream whatever you do to ensure that these societies are protected. They're extremely vulnerable. It's an extremely vulnerable population. And so in consideration, we want to make sure to avoid any adverse impacts or minimize impacts on these communities, groups, or individuals. And furthermore, in relation to this, and again, I have to stress that these are things that we could talk about or discuss later. It is a lot to consume in a relatively short time. And in the Declaration of the Human Rights, this is established and enshrined in the Human Rights Declaration that for indigenous peoples, for international labor organization and conventions, and in international covenant and economic and social cultural rights. Performance standard number 8, I'll go quickly. This deals with the cultural heritage, and those are things can be historic objects. In our case, in Belize, we have the the Mayan temples, the Mayan sites is littered all over the country. It's all over the place. And we want to make sure that these cultural and sacred sites are spaces that are protected, and that any archaeological finds that has to do with religious or cultural significance are properly identified. These include tangible expressions, so also knowledge practice. When you're writing up your concept note, we have to make sure that we explicitly express the issues that we may find or that may be affected, that may affect the issues of cultural heritage. And the last performance standard is the stakeholder engagement, and it includes gender, particularly establish stakeholder engagement in relation to also gender. And I'm saying sometimes I'm speaking and it's all inclusive, and I'll speak later on specific information that relates to gender, because we don't want to in some way by our, maybe not consciously, but not include specific issues that are related to gender. So the stakeholder information is absolutely important, because we want to make sure that those engagements are targeted at particular groups or individuals and no one is left behind. And this will be in relation to probably your project, the specific project or the nature of your project. So I think it should be considered that you should be thoughtful and considerate in relation to how you develop your stakeholder engagement plan and how you disclose information. Because again, sometimes we could do it with no bad intent, but in doing certain types of stakeholders, certain sets of people are not included in the conversation. And these conversations we're talking about should take place at the very onset of your project. So these are the 9 performance standards. And again, they are considerations that that are strongly worded in relation to what you must do in executing or developing your project or projects or program, and what considerations you must include for give your project the best possibility of success. So I'll move on and I'll touch on to the gender issues. And as we know, ultimately, we want to make sure that there's gender equality. So again, the definition of sex and gender, there's a slight difference. And if I'm taking it from the World Health Organization description, explanation, that sex refers to the biological and psychological characteristics of women and men, and gender refers to the socially constructed norms, roles, and relations that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. Gender determines what is expected, permitted, and valued in a woman or man, or in a determined context. And I have to establish that, because it is in this context that we will explain what is the issues relating to gender, and how do we mainstream gender into the projects that we do. And there's a consideration or concern for gender stereotype. We assign the roles, of course, based on what we said, and responsibility based on that preconceived set of norms that are typically defined as a person or a group of persons. So I think this, again, sometimes it's not consciously we do it, but because of tradition and norms and culture, we have sometimes these issues become evident, and it is our responsibility to make sure that gender and gender issues is clearly articulated in all the projects, and to make sure it's not only in the projects, but also in the operations, and this is after the project implementation. So in general, gender, when we speak of gender, it's a fundamental construct created by societies, and we'll deal with that now.
All right, Ian, just giving you your 3-minute warning.
Okay, so, oh, it's 40 minutes already? Damn. So, okay, so,
Maybe you can go a little
Sorry,
bit
Ian. Sorry,
longer.
Ian. You have 13 minutes. So that was my mistake. I thought you only had 30 minutes for your presentation, but it's 40, so you're still good.
okay, sorry, thanks. I'll still continue. The traditional provider, protector, the men are considered the caregiver of the home, and the traditional examples of the roles. And therefore, the responsibilities are separated based on perceived physical strength, ability, and to negotiate and compare. And I think sometimes we would take this a bit carelessly, because in our everyday conversations, we get carried away that sometimes you would say, if a boy is doing something, people might refer to it. I've heard men colleagues refer to it, that is too girly, that is not something for a man to do. In the conversely, that you might see things that a woman is doing, or a woman, they're saying that a woman is sometimes, I heard once someone saying, not a friend, but someone saying that women are emotional, but they're more sensitive. So they're more constructive in their thinking. So there are different constructs for men and women, and we have to make sure that these things are represented properly, addressed, and representative. So, for example, we have an issue we're planning to develop a polyclinic in a particular area, and this polyclinic maybe is serving a community. And this is where data and information comes in. And we're expecting that the person that they're serving, maybe it's pregnant women or women for regular checkup, to get to a polyclinic. But in trying to do so, there's several obstacles in the way. And these obstacles might come from having money, maybe the transportation system. So while we address the issue of the healthcare or health facility or caring, there is difficulty with that for that person to get, if it's a man, woman, boy, or girl, to get from where they are to that facility. So there must be inclusion and gender equality. For projects to reduce the burden on individuals, they must have that social and gender. So therefore, we must say that projects should have the social and gender experts intertwined. And in a way, we can do this in one way that I'll speak about, to have more women seated at the table. So the traditional, I spoke of the traditional construct. The modern construct is for equal opportunity for men, women, boys, and girls to be integrated into the society, the financial independence, and the rights to decisions and livelihoods. Some key terms, I'll just go through these quickly. It's gender negative, and the gender negative is when you confine gender norms to certain sexes, if it's men or women. And the stereotypes I spoke about, the gender neutral, it's considered norms and roles in relation that are not affected, worsen, or improve, and sensitive. I think this is where we want to be at a gender sensitive position, where we need to make sure that we are addressing everything that would have an impact on people, and the roles and addressing gender norms, roles, and access to resources, and insofar as needed to reach project goals. Gender positive, of course, we'd like to be here. So, and finally, gender transformative. This is what transforming unequal gender relation and promote shared power, control, and resources, decision-making, and support for women and women empowerment. So these are important key terms for you to remember when you're doing your project. And then finally, the mainstreaming. And the mainstreaming, I think the big question here is, what is it that you need to see, or what is it that you will see, or what is it that you will know when we could say that gender is mainstreamed into our society? And I think in general, it starts from the data collection, and my colleague mentioned that we have to have information that is centric, is gender specific, is community specific. We can't generalize based on a global view or even a regional view or even a national view. But these things have to be in the context of the local community. And if we're dealing with a community, we make sure that we have information that is disaggregated for the proper analysis. And if you look at the methods and tools, it outlines a number of methods and tools to make sure that gender is mainstreaming into the society. This is easy. You can go into an organization, or you can look at your project and you could ask, what are the specific information in relation to gender? Do they do an audit? Do they do an awareness? Have they done an awareness? Is there training within the organization? Is there gender evaluation? And is there institutional transformation from all of this? Because you might be intimately involved with the institution, and you could say whether or not they've made strides in relation to dealing with gender and gender issues or not. It is straightforward. So this is just a chart to show you the gender mainstreaming strategy that you should consider in your project. I'll move on. And in 5Cs, the appraisal of your project takes place at a very, very early stage, and to make sure that at the concept notes stage, and there are a number of forms. I heard one of the participants ask about forms. And for the 5Cs, it goes through a cycle. And once we get it through, we identify and prepare, and we do the appraisal, and we submit to the donor. But at the identification and preparation phase, it's important for us to have all these safeguards built in, and this will give your program or project the best possibility of moving forward. So this is just in the context of the 5Cs. How do we deal and we move from one point to another? The projects, when we identify the projects, it falls into 3 categories. The first category is category A, and this is the extreme case where there may be significant adverse impacts for your project. And if the project is sensitive and diverse, so we normally request certain information, and this is in terms of the risk assessment, I would say the worst case, that you have to ensure that you address risk and the hazards and the risks that are related to your project. And the second is the category B, and this is where normally the 5Cs operate, where it's likely to have potential for moderate adverse environmental impacts. Some of these impacts are normally easy to identify, and they have mitigation strategies that they know work and could be applied. Some things may be specific in relation to jurisdiction. And the final that normally would deal with the category C project will deal with normally with mostly capacity building, and where there is minimal or no, I would say no environmental and social or gender impacts. And we can move forward with just implementing a general mitigation guide. So this is attributed to education, awareness, capacity building projects. So what are the successful and unsuccessful outcomes for your projects? I would say that the don'ts. I think projects that suppress or even have a semblance or shows some suppression or trample on the rights of people, you prevent access or erode the confidence in the path to justice. And I think it's lack proper stakeholder and gender action plans. This is important. This will definitely derail your project and will have a difficulty but there are ways, like we express, that you can mitigate against these measures. And also when you're dealing with disclosure of information. Information is key, and that builds a society, and that strengthens a society, and that reduces the impact. So hopefully now the climate action is normally, we want to make sure that there is a paradigm shift. It doesn't matter with the project, but in this case, especially so, the health sector is one of the most important sector in this whole fight against climate change. Unfortunately, the health sector will take the brunt of it. A number of the mitigation measures or the adaptation measures will be taken to ensure that the health sector is not overburdened with the issues. So we want to see a paradigm shift in low emission, climate resilient development pathways in a sustainable manner. But the do's is that the involvement of beneficiaries and the gender mainstreaming is important from the beginning. This will create better projects, and it should improve the lives and livelihoods of the targeted populations with co-benefits and positive collateral implications. And these co-benefits, if you look at, in the case of, you have maybe a mitigation project. So while it may be a mitigation project and it deals with the reduction of CO2 in the atmosphere, or greenhouse gases, the contamination, maybe the reduction, if you're dealing with reducing the greenhouse gas, it might have implications for better air quality and better water quality, better soil quality. So those are the core benefits we're looking to. And with that, in the case of a health sector, that means that you will have you're seeing less people showing up at the hospital with either communicable or non-communicable diseases. So this will definitely be a collateral, a co-benefit in relation. So we want to make sure to end this now, the projects that restore and improve environmental and social quality and ecological services is absolutely important in the drive to what we're doing. Biodiversity protection, people rely on this, and this also helps with ensuring that there's sustainable livelihoods for future generation. We want to make sure that the rural and vulnerable groups are not adversely affected, of course. So we don't want for them to have disruption in their shelter or livelihoods due to more intense storms. So projects that help in relieving those impacts will help. We want to contribute to natural hazards and risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So projects of this nature are usually we give strong consideration to. And also if projects that deals with the improvement and efficiency of renewable energy and those that reduce greenhouse gas. So greenhouse gases. So I think I'm almost out of time now. So yes, and that's the end of it. Thank you very much. Over to you, Keisha.
Hey, thank you, Ian. Right on time. Is there any questions for Ian at this time? If you have any quick question, we can probably take one or two. If not, then we can just go over to Vincent so he can do a very quick explanation of what we'll be doing in the breakout groups.
Excuse me, one question. Sorry, I'm Sam Simonet from the Bahamas. It's been very educational. I wanted to find out, is there any way we could share the presentation to us?
Yes. Once you register, the presentations and the recordings will be shared with you today. So as soon as we're finished and we have gathered all the presentations and the recordings, we'll be sending out these through by email.
I'd really thank you all for taking time to talk on this very pertinent subject. It's really timely. Thank you so much. Blessings.
Thank you. Thank you too for joining.
Yes.
Keisha?
Sorry, yes again?
Yes, just quickly, you could also share the contact information and they could contact us directly, either through the center, the numbers are on the center's website, but they could also contact us directly, either through one of these social app teams, teams or any other way.
Yes, and I think your contact information is in your presentation as well.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So you can feel free to contact the presenters if you have any specific questions. Okay, so Vincent, we'll go over to you briefly so you can give a little overview of what we'll be doing in the breakout groups.
Okay, Keisha, good morning, everybody. Well, good morning, good afternoon, as the case may be. Basically, you will be continuing on as you did yesterday, completing that baseline logical framework with information regarding your projects, and using the questions that are in there on the various sections, right, to as your guide to provide information, as much information as you can at this particular stage on the various project ideas that you have. If you look at the baseline logical form, it basically covers all of the elements of a project. So so it's basically to go through the different sections and complete it. Those of you who would have started that exercise yesterday would be familiar with what is required basically to do that. So very briefly, that's what I would suggest that you do, and with the excellent from the moderators. The idea is to try and make as much headway as possible to fill out as much as possible of the form. And I'm not sure how many would have completed the sections on the situation analysis. And of course, you've had the benefit this morning of the discussion on the theory of change and question and this presentation by Ian. So using that information and using the initial project ideas, or even if you have new ones from yesterday, you can proceed to complete that form. Over.
Thank you, Vincent. Everyone, do you have your copy of the baseline logical framework? It was shared at 9 in the chat. So it was shared at 9:13. So you might have to scroll up a bit, or I think maybe Michelle is adding it again. If you do not have a copy, we sent it out yesterday and we downloaded it yesterday. So it's the same one you're using, but for persons who might just be joining us today, you can download the copy of the baseline logical framework. I think we are going now. So Michelle, take it away.
you have my contact information.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Yes, definitely. So what do you have for us today? Have you managed to advance on the framework that we sent yesterday? You have a copy? The one that was shared with you?
Yeah, I've got a copy here somewhere.
I would like to hear from the other group members. I think we only we have 40 minutes, so we have a little bit more time today. So I am hoping that you had the opportunity with your schedule to relay.
I'm hearing another look like
Yeah.
Would you like more time? Vincent, is there time for if the groups need an additional 5 or 10 minutes?
I think we're just about wrap up. Daniel, is there anything else that you needed to add?
Yeah, well, since we're back in the main group, I don't know if it was covered before, but Chris had asked a question in our group, and I think it could be to the benefit of everybody here. So I could have the opportunity to repeat what the question was and then answer the question, and then I think that should cover it because everybody would benefit from. So Chris had asked about, if there's monies available from the GCF to fund small projects. So I was trying to explain to Chris the different funding windows that are available through the GCF for funding projects. I don't know if that was covered yesterday, but I started to do that. There is one window called the Readiness and Preparatory Support window, where each country is allocated $1 million per year to spend mainly on activities that enable the country to build its capacity, to get entities accredited to the GCF, to put in place certain systems, to do national adaptation planning. So if countries deem their health sector as being, as needing this sort of support, they could prioritize the health sector to benefit through that window for that sort of effort. The other windows we have include the simplified approval process, which is funding up to $10 million. The GCF will provide up to $10 million for that project. But the project could be valued way more than that. The GCF will only provide $10 million. And Chris, this is where some of those smaller projects that you mentioned could fit. However, there is a catch or certain considerations that we have to give to those projects that qualified under the SAP. One, they must have little to no environmental or social impact. So we shouldn't have any environmental or social impact beyond them being small or non-existent. The other aspect of it is that the project is not, how should I put it, not very complicated in terms of it could be you're scaling or you're replicating some other project that has taken place before. You don't necessarily need a feasibility study, but it would be useful that you have some sort of feasibility study. They've mentioned a pre-feasibility study done for that project. Again, it's up to $10 million, but I just to be in the spirit of transparency, even though it's called a simplified approval process, the process still requires a kind of rigor and analysis that we've been trying to convey to you guys over the past couple of days. You know, you need your climate rational, you need your log frame to be solid. You want to ensure that you have a well-developed project to access that. And then there's a regular funding window where 5Cs is accredited for up to $50 million. So we could submit projects that are valued up to $50 million to the GCF. And that is purely grant funding though that we are accredited for. But there is entity like CDB that is accredited for both grants and loans. And they are accredited for up to $50 million as well. There's another facility called the Enhanced Direct Access Facility. But what that requires is that you need an AE to submit a proposal surrounding a particular thematic area where that entity could unlock some funding, and that funding could then be ungranted to NGOs, community-based organizations, and various entities in the different countries. It's supposed to operate similar to like the UN small grants program, but not necessarily as small as that, because the accredited entity has some control over, you know, what the modality of the facility would look like. It's for you to put together that proposal and submit it. And so if you had a set of small scale project of the nature that you mentioned, the EDA facility could also be one that supports that. I hope that helped, Chris.
Chris, are you still there?
Yes. Thank you very much to Donald. That is really helpful, and it's great to hear that there are these opportunities for smaller projects to be funded through the GCF as well. So thank you very much for that extra information.
There's a question from Danville, I think. Danville, you have your hand up.
Yes, please. Just a quick question, a follow-up question to what was just stated, and I think came out from the breakout group. It might have been mentioned, but for clarity, we are saying that if we have a project and have a white paper, which is we can contact from the numbers that we have been given directly for support. I don't know if the question is clear, but I wanted to find out. It was mentioned that a white paper with a concept could have been developed, and then for clarity and for guidance, you can see assistance from the presenters. So I'm just asking whether or not that I am getting it clear.
Vincent, you wanna take that question? Vincent?
I'm sorry, Tisha, I'm not sure I understood the question.
Oh, he was asking if there is
sorry,
a.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. He was asking if there is a white, like you have a project idea. There's already some effort and research. You've developed a white paper for a project, and you want assistance in developing it further. Would they be able to reach out to the 5Cs project developers for assistance with that?
And it was a follow-up too. We had a breakout a while ago when we were in the group, before we came back in the general group. So I had a question, but because we automatically came over back to the large group, I didn't get a chance to ask it. So I just wanted some clarity as to whether or not I understood it clearly.
If I may comment on the question about a project ID, from a Grenada standpoint, how I understand it and how it works here is you must go through, present a concept note or the project ID to your national designated authority in your country. That national designated authority is accredited to the GCF. And once that idea is presented there, then they're the ones have to mobilize the resources to develop it into probably a concept note or into a project. And this is where they're going to reach out to organizations like the 5Cs, PAHO, and other accredited entity to develop that project further for onward submission to the GCF to follow those processes. I'm not sure if it is different in other islands, but that is how it's done here in Grenada.
Yeah. If I may chime in, just a couple, because there are a few considerations that emerge there. But basically, the NDA, as Dan Raj mentioned, if you are going to the GCF, right, there's need for that to gain their support, basically. And if it is a health project, if it has something related to health, then of course the support of the health sector is required as well. That's where the important issue of dimension of country ownership and stakeholder consultation has to take place. Now, Dan Raj who mentioned about a concept note? I mean, it does not necessarily. You don't necessarily have to present a full concept note. You can come with the idea and that you're working with, as I mentioned before, the people from the health sector, NDA, and so on. That could be developed. It can even be part of an augmented to another program or overall program to address challenges that climate change is imposing on the health sector in the country. So that's one dimension, one answer. The other thing to remember is that in the context of this project, we are not limited to seeking funding only from the GCF. So there will be opportunities there to pursue other sources of funding as well. And the question of whether or not you can reach out to 5Cs to get assistance, certainly as is being done now, you do so, as I mentioned, in collaboration with and through the process of the NDA and your health sector officials once it is a health project. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
And in fact, since there's a silent interlude, in fact, this was one of the issues that what Donald spoke of earlier in terms of the different modalities, the further elaboration or explanation on what both Ryan and I had spoken about yesterday. That these are some of the things that would have to be considered when you submit your project idea or proposal. Which modality exactly would be the best fit to get it on the way, and perhaps it can even serve as a precursor to a further initiative. As for example, in the context of the Bahamas, we spoke in our group of a number of initiatives, right, that seem to be more of the nature of software type, for want of a better expression. That's how I describe it, software type programs, data analysis, data gathering, data information, and so on. And maybe that a lot of that could be done through your readiness, for example. And then that then serves as the basis to build out a much larger project or program. Well, what do you think?
Thank you, Vincent. I think you started to get into the next part that we needed to do, which is the next steps. So I think you can continue with that. It's 11:05 here, which would be, I think 1:05 for some persons. So we have about 10 more minutes within our time schedule. So I don't think we would be able to share any of the projects or ideas that came out of the breakout groups. But perhaps, Vincent, you can start with the next steps after this workshop.
He's
He
Sorry, I've been talking and I was muted, so now I have to
okay.
try to remember. Yeah, so I said I think Donil started that discussion by describing the various windows that are available, and I certainly would have liked to have get from the other groups, even if very briefly, some of the ideas that are emerging. But I think a lot of the discussions that emerge over the course of the past 2 days suggest that there's a lot of convergence in terms of the ideas, right? There's whether they be mitigation. There was a lot of discussion on possibility of doing what can be described as mitigation type initiatives, whether individual country or using a programmatic approach where several countries can come together and collaborate in terms of one program that would deliver for each country outputs and outcomes for each specific country, even though they are part of an integrated set of a program that involves several countries, multiple countries. So that's one approach. There was also a lot of there was some discussion of pilot type programs, right? That it depends on what is involved. We can look at them and pursue them without calling them pilot programs, right? And there's also others where the software elements that we can look at in terms of whether they be a NAP or individual country NAP, individual country readiness programs, or perhaps a regional NAP, which is made up basically of, which is a consolidation of several country programs. Those who are that type of arrangement. And all of this to say that the 5 Cs working in collaboration with the NDA in particular, which is the authority, and that is in the case of the GCF, which is the authority, the focal point in the country for GCF matters, that we can work in collaboration with them and provide whatever assistance is needed that is in line with country priorities and to assist the countries in developing the proposal, specifically in the context of the EU PAHO project. This EU PAHO project, under whose auspices this workshop is being held, we have a requirement to engage the countries to produce a number of concept notes, right? And also to provide complementary capacity building, right, in support of building those concept notes, which should come out of your HNAPs and VNA assessment. And this workshop is one such endeavor. We certainly will, as needed, provide support, both in terms of helping the countries to, articulate their ideas, get agreement on what the basic framework of what those ideas are, and then set about to flesh out and elaborate on them in terms of developing proposal. But there would have to be engagement and discussion first, so that we can be able to advise the countries as to what is their best approach, given what they deem or determine to be their priorities. Whether you go the route of the readiness, as I mentioned before, or the NAP, or you pursue a program that involves, say, for example, a mitigation program that looks at, as one person mentioned, basically the climate smart or climate proofing your health facilities. I don't know if there are any questions or further clarification required based on that. Over. I would also this silent interlude again. I would also want if Donila or Ryan have any suggestions or anything that they want to add to what I've just said, to do so.
Nothing from my side, Vincent.
Okay, so I think we have about 7 more minutes or so. Keisha, perhaps, if anybody has any further questions on this, on any of those issues or anything coming out of the last, our deliberations over the last 2 days that they want to ask about, this is a good time to do so.
Yes, definitely, Vincent. Yeah, this is your opportunity. If you have any questions, in terms of the Excel sheet, Vincent, do you want them to continue to fill that out, and what can be done with it, or?
Yes, and this was a matter that I stressed in our group, right? That they continue, and that was the group with the Bahamas, and there's some participation from Jamaica, that they continue to fill that out, and they can send that directly to us. So that's one immediate, if you like, point of engagement and for further interaction. So you can the Excel sheet, the baseline logical framework, as we call it. If once you complete it, it could basically present, even if it's in initial draft form, all of the elements of what could be a full proposal. So if you continue on with that, you do that and send that immediately to us, then that's an immediate point of engagement. And based on our feedback, we can discuss how to go forward with the specific initiative that you have. We are basically in touch with the NDAs, right, and the health officials in all of those countries. So if it means that, for example, one of our recommendations would be to let's engage the broader health fraternity and the NDA and so on, then that's something that we can, an activity that we can initiate immediately. So I certainly would want to encourage that.
There's a question from Ms. Jacinta Higgs of the Bahamas.
Thank you so very much, Honorable Keisha, for allowing me to speak very briefly. I immediately served as Director of the Department of Gender and Family Affairs in the Bahamas, and then also as Director of the Sustainable Development Goals Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister. I want to say that I would have heard for the past 3 years in office, billions of dollars thrown around. It's really sad. It's sickening. It is also deceptive, and also could be received by some of us on the Bahamas and disingenuous to be saying that in meetings that I would have gone to nationally, regional, internationally, and yet, you have NGOs who are willing to do the work, my God, and can't even get a $5,000 grant. I am so thankful to have been invited to this meeting by Dr. Khaled Philippe, who is now preceded me and is Director of Gender and Family Affairs. And because our able facilitator, Mr. Vincent Peter, guided us towards the initiative going on in the Bahamas, ways that we can become involved, what are some of the objectives, the overall goal, etc. And so now I am seeing persons who are directly communicating within the chat with regards to how thankful we are, how engaged and interested we are with regards to what is needed to be done. Again, please, as I sat in Caraforum meetings, I'm telling you, you hear the Americans given $10 billion, but you're also hearing people from COP26 lament that a lot of the money has not hit the ground. Please, Madam Keisha Rodriguez and Facilitator Vincent Peter, do not let a dollar go back if we can help it. If there were projects that were already done in the Bahamas, so Jamaica was beautifully represented in the group where I was just now, and Vincent Peter guided her to know that right now they're doing something in the Bahamas, and definitely Jamaica is next. If there is something that has worked in even other countries, Just share the projects with us, celebrate the projects in your reports, and then let us move with regards to replicating it. Because in the Bahamas, we don't just have one island. There are about 25 islands and keys with people on it. Most of them are rural. The one where I live, New Providence, Nassau, New Providence, is the capital, the smallest one, mostly populated. And again, even the resources are not trickling down to the NGOs that we work with. So I represent Civil Society Bahamas just now coming out of government. And I want to say, please, man, if I put my email in there, if you can send us documents that we can include Civil Society Bahamas to get some of this money, it will make it look as if our roles would have been achieved spiritually, professionally, and nationally for our people. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for that great intervention, Ms. Jacinta Higgs. I think we definitely that's the objective of these workshops, to ensure that we get the resources that we need for our countries to be able to respond to the climate impacts in all the different sectors. And I know the health sector is critical, especially at this time where we're just now getting out of the COVID pandemic, and you know, all the vulnerabilities that still exist, and you know, and has been exacerbated. So definitely a critical time. Is there any other questions, comments at this time? Okay, I think we are just about that time, so we can bring the workshop to an end. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating yesterday and for participating today. We hope that you were able to, all the information you were able to absorb, and you will be able to utilize it as you come up with some innovative paradigm shifting projects for your country, and maybe even, as Vincent mentioned, programs that could be regional in this sector. So I thank you all for your participation, for being interactive. And as I mentioned before, we will be sending the recordings as well as the presentations to you today. And of course, feel free to reach out to the presenters as we move forward. Here's it. Hello, Vincent.
No, well, I think you overheard me saying something, but maybe I can just use the opportunity to point out that the 5Cs expects to initiate very soon a learning management platform, right? And the endeavor will be to have a lot of these programs. Now, this is what we've given over the course of the last 2 days. That's just you know, I said a teaser. So there are broader elements of, you know, of how to develop a proposal and so on, a concept note, etc. And we expect to be making a lot of this information available through a sort of self-paced program online. So, you know, I want to tell people that this is coming, and they can look forward to this. So they can be able to go there at any time at their own pace, you know, and from there assimilate the information. If they have questions, they can send off inquiries to us, etc.
Before we leave, Keisha, I also wanted to share that the 5Cs has a regional clearinghouse. That's a repository for climate change information that's specific to the Caribbean. You can find that at our website at caribbeanclimate.bz, or directly at the link clearinghouse.caribbeanclimate.bz. There's a collection on, thanks to the EU PAHO project, there's a collection on information on climate change on health. So there are the HNAPs, and there's a cool collection on the HNAPs that have been developed so far, and the ones that are being developed will eventually be stored there after they're completed. So if you're looking for resources, please feel free. The information is readily available.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And that is, yes, very needed. We need to know where the information and data is to develop these projects. So again, thank you everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Madam Keisha. Well done as usual. Thanks. Have a nice day too.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, everyone. It was a wonderful experience. Trust you all have a great day and be safe.